Hi guys, welcome to another video on my channel. So in this particular video, we're going to be taking a look at how we are going to recreate this particular animation as we can see on the course site. So what we could see right now is just a mock-up of a laptop, right? Then inside the particular screen, we have some animations happening on interval, or should I say they are basically happening for every seconds. We have different color transitions, and let's take a look at this again. We are gonna be building this with Tailwind CSS and also Framer Motion. Yeah, I also want to mention that we have a video of where we created the color site from scratch, and we created the generator, you creating a particular color palette, and we created it with Next.js, Tailwind CSS, Framer Motion for the animation. So we basically created everything you could see here from scratch, and I'll also leave a link to the particular video in the video description. Make sure to check it out. Without wasting much time, let's jump right into code. As we can see on the particular screen right now, I just have VS Code open up here, and also we have Next.js installed and also Framer Motion installed. So let's go to the package.json and have a look at what we currently have. So we just have Framer Motion installed, Next.js installed, and we also have CSS installed. So those are what we're using to achieve the particular animation. So if you go to the page, what we just have here is just an SVG, which represents our particular laptop. And yeah, I think that's just what we have there. Then we have a class setting the width of this particular container, so we'll be able to see our SVG properly. So if you run this on localhost, you should be able to see this particular mockup as you can see here. Now mind you, this animation right now, or should I say this particular pages, are all static colors, right? So what we're trying to achieve right now is just to animate these colors for every second, as you can see on the original site. So let's go back to doing this, and like we said, we're going to be using Framer Motion. So the first thing first, let's quickly import Framer Motion, and we are going to be making use of the use animate. So the use animate hook from Framer Motion is basically a way of creating animations. So if you're familiar with Framer Motion, right, and you want to create animations in your React applications, you mostly have to go with using the motion components, which is actually also imported from Framer Motion, right? Then you come down here and say dev.motion. You come down here and say motion.dev. That way this automatically becomes a Framer Motion component, right? Or a motion component which you could animate with your transition properties and all. But for this example, we are going to be making use of the use animate hook, because the use animate hook basically gives us more control around our animation. Now, the first things first, if you go back here, you can see we have 6 different colors, right? Or okay, we have 5 different colors that are changing, right? So first off, let's create a function in JavaScript, right? Or let's create a function that says, we could call this get some random colors, and what we want this to do is we want this to create random colors for us. And for us to do that, there's a very easier way of making random colors, just making use of the math.floor and also the math.random, and in between a particular string. So for us to do that, let's just return in this function, we're going to return an hash, because remember, we just want to work with hex values for our colors, right? And for that, we just going to concatenate this to, like, okay, give us something math.floor, and we're rounding it to return the greatest integer less, right, or equal to its numeric argument. And inside here, we're also going to say this should be math. Okay, wrong spelling. We want to run this on random, and we have to instantiate it. Cool. Then we could also say times it by a particular value. Now this value is not random, yeah. And let's say Ctrl+Z or Z. Okay, so we have this, and what we're currently gonna do next is say we have these values, right? And we're gonna say, okay, you're gonna return to string, right? To string of 16 for us. So let's format this properly. Okay, so let's try logging our console and see what we currently have now. Get random color, and yeah, cool. So we get random value. So let's load this again. We have a random value at this point that represents our color, right? So we're getting a random value. If we refresh the page again and see this, we should have another random value. Cool. Now to visualize this properly, I think we could start animating our properties at this point. Now we have different parts, right? We have the parts, which is this first one, and we've added a class of first, we've added a class of second, we've added a class of third, a class of fourth, and we added a class of fifth. Now the reason why we added those classes is so we'll be able to target this particular element from our use animate hook. Now let's get animating. So first off, let's say const scope. Then we also have access to the animate, right? The animate function that's exposed from user animate. So if you don't really understand what's happening here, everything here is all in the documentation, right? So you could set this up in the documentation directly. It says it cannot be used at top level. Okay, we're gonna take this out and we're gonna use it inside there since it's a hook. Yeah, correct. And we have that value running, or we have that particular state for us. So the next thing for us to do, or the next thing we're going to do in our case now, is to actually write the function that does it for us. If you go to use animate from framer motion, okay, if you go to use animate from framer motion and take a look at what it does, it says it creates an animate function with scoped selectors and automatic cleanup, right? The use animate provides a way of using the animate function that's scoped. It provides a scope like what we already did, right? It provides a scope, which is a ref, and an animate function where every DOM selector is scoped to this particular ref. So this is what we're going to be using. This is what we just did, where we are instantiating our particular hooks. And now the next thing for us to do is this. We're going to set up our scope, but then we're going to set up our animation directly. So now this is just an example. A use effect, if this particular component is in view, then we're going to animate. So using the function directly here. Yeah, I think this would make more sense once we do it. Okay, so cool. So we have this, and let's quickly set up a use effect, and let's just clean this up real quick. We have a use effect. This should be coming from React, and let's quickly fix that. Okay, cool. We have this, and the next thing we're going to say is now we want this particular thing to happen for a number of time, right? We want this particular animation to keep on happening, and for us to achieve something like this, okay, so we have our use effects, and the next thing we need to do basically is to start animating this particular classes that we have here. And for us to do that, let's take a look at this one more time and see what we are trying to do. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is for our first value, right? We're going to animate this, and we're going to animate this for an interval, then we're animating this and animating this and also animating this, right? So the idea now is, for me, is to make a loop, right? A loop that doesn't end, or a loop that continually, or that actually runs for a very long time, or should I say forever, until this particular component on mount, right? And what other powerful way to do that than to make use of the while loop? And first off, I think we could create a function here, and we could just call this function and say this function is going to be called, we could say this should be, we could just say animate SVG. Yeah, you could call this wherever you want to call it. So we're going to say animate SVG BG, right? And this animation basically is going to be a while loop, and we're going to say for while, let's just have a while loop statement here, right? So while is always going to be true, and if it's true, what are we going to do now? If you look at the documentation about use animate again, it could be in the position where you need to make animations sequentially. That's the whole idea around using the use animate hook, right? To be able to create animations sequentially and run animations after each animation is done. And that's what we could currently see here, right? So when you're making use of the use animate hook, you could bind your animations to await, which is basically saying that this particular animation is asynchronous, right? And that is what we are going to be doing here. So first of all, we're going to say we're going to await our function, right, which is animate. And the animate function, as you can see in the documentation here, it takes in the particular scope, right, of the value of what we want to work in, then it takes in some objects of the animation. So we have the use animate, and we are going to target the particular part of our code down here. Remember, we have some classes that we added here, right? So those are going to be our targets. And before we do that, or before we start animating this, let's quickly set up our ref. Now remember, we have a scope, which basically says in the documentation, right, which represents the ref. And in React, ref is just like a reference to that particular container or that particular container here in the DOM. So we are going to go down here and say this is going to handle our ref. Ref is going to be equal to our scope. So at this point, Framer Motion will be able to know where and what kind of targets or what kind of element it's looking for. So we have our function here, and this function is supposed to make a while loop for our animations. And I think we could just add an extra value here, TypeScript, right? Let's quickly type this. This is just going to be a string and a string of our class. And since we're going to be reusing this particular function, we're going to pass in target, right? Then pass in some other object. We're going to pass in some extra objects, and it says await can only be performed in an async function. Okay, let's quickly fix that. So this is just going to be an async function. Then we're going to await each of this animation, right? And for that, we are going to say for each of our targets, each of our items, we are going to change the properties of the field. Now let's go down here and go back to our code. Now, as you can see here, we have the first, we have the second, and we have the third, right? So this basically says the field of yellow. Now let's make this the field of color red and see if that changes. That changes, right? So what property are we gonna try to target with use animate? We are gonna be making use of, we are gonna be targeting the field property. Now the field property has to be what color. Remember, it has to be dynamic because we already have a function up here. Okay, let's take this inside here, and for simplicity, we already have a function here, right, that returns some hex value or some hex colors which we could use. And I think this is not spelled correctly. Random. Cool. So we have this function which does it for us, and we inside our function, right, we could just say we could create a variable that's equals to, or that's basically same as our random color function up here. Then now we're gonna make use of this color for this. Now see, we're almost there. Just take a recap of what we're doing here right now. So we have a function that animates SVG BG that takes in a target. Then the targets awaits, right? Then it changes the particular field color of our particular target. Now let's make use of this function. Now if you go into our use effects, we're gonna say we're gonna call in this function. Now remember, this function expects a property, or we expect a target, and our targets for now, let's just quickly say we want to target the third class, right? And we want to target the third class right now. And that way, let's format this and have a look. Refresh the page again and see what we currently have. Okay, now remember, we already had coded the color for the field. Okay, let's take a look. There's an error, no valid element provided. Okay, cool. So we are gonna be fixing this, and for us to fix this, we are gonna make sure before we try doing any animation inside our function, we're gonna make sure our scope value exists. And this is how we're gonna do it, right? We're gonna say if there's a scope, right? Remember, our scope is basically just a ref from React. If there's a scope occurrence, only then, right, are we gonna try making this animation or this particular. Now let's quickly see if this works for us and format this again. Okay, cool. So we have this, and we still have our error. It says no valid element provided. Interesting. What we're doing wrong here right now. Okay, we are currently not putting this in the right path. So inside our while loop, okay, I think let me just take this out real quick again. Inside our while loop, we're gonna say cut this out and put this in here, right? Then we're gonna put this here. So we're saying in our while loop, before our while loop runs, right, it's gonna make sure the current or the scope, the current actually exists before doing any animation. So let's format this again and see if this fixes the issue for us. Okay, we still have the same error. It says no valid elements provided. Okay, it says no valid item provided. I think the reason is because if we go back to the documentation again and we take a look at this, it says it takes in the scope and takes in the particular animate. Then if you go down here, right, this animate property is supposed to take in the current, or should I say it's supposed to take in the particular target. Now the target basically it could be anything, right? And it says the selector is an AI, but we're not selecting all the AI elements, only those that are the child of the scope elements. So what we're doing wrong right now at this point is we aren't defining what kind of targets we want to make use of, because this is supposed to just be a class, right? We have to tell framework motion that this is a class. We putting third here, or we just putting third, basically means that it's just going to be maybe a tag or an HTML tag, but in our case, this is more like a class name we already defined. So let's format this again and see what we currently have. So we have this, and interesting, we have animate PG, and now let's add more values here. Let's say for our fifth class, we also want to change the color to some random color. Now let's reload this page and see what happens this time. So let's format our page again and see. Okay, I think this particular animation is sending our components into an infinite state. So we have an if statement here, right? If the scope the occurrence, then we're going to animate the fill of that particular target, like, right? And we don't have an else statement, right? So this is just gonna throw our components, or throw this particular component into a forever it's gonna throw our components into a forever loop. So what we're just gonna do, you're gonna say else, just break the animation. Yeah, and let's refresh this and see what we currently have. Okay, let's open on that and see what we have. So if we reload this page again, you notice how the values are changing, right? So for every time we load the page, we get a random color. We get a random color, and we get a random color. Okay, so let's quickly set up more of this. So we're gonna say for the first class, we're also gonna change it to a random color. Okay, so our animation is sending this particular page into an infinite loop, and that's why you see our page is unresponsive here. And I think for us to just fix that, mostly we've already make sure that we're making use of the scope elements only when it's available, and we're also breaking this animation, right, if we have an else statement. So the last thing we could do here to make sure that doesn't happen, or this particular issue we're having now, is this particular variable. We're going to make sure this variable is inside our while loop, right? And the reason why we want to do that is because we want it to happen, or we want this to happen while inside our loop. So I'll show that real quick why we did that and why we had to do that. Let's reload the page all over and wait for this to load up. Yeah, cool. And we could see the animation happening. All our colors are changing, right? So we've been able to first off solidify that we can actually animate the fill of our SVGs. And if you notice, one value is not changing here, and that should be the second one. And we have the second, we have the first, fifth, third. We don't have the fourth. So let's target the fourth element here. So we're gonna target the fourth class, and with that, let's refresh the page again and see. Yeah, as you can see right now, I think we have two errors. It says it's not an unusable color, use the equivalent code instead. And okay, I think that should be our issue. But like we're seeing the animation already happening. And if you go back to the original animation, the one we are trying to recreate from the color site, we could have a look here and see that this doesn't happen more frequently like ours happens, right? It has some delay, and it also has some particular duration of how long it's supposed to happen, right? And let's quickly fix that in our animation. And for us to do that, we just have to add an animation, or we just need to add a delay to this particular animation, because if you notice, it just happens frequently, and that is not the kind of like the required animation we want. So with the use animate hook again, remember we have the first object which is holding the property we want to animate. Then we could also have a separate property or a separate object, right, which basically is for our transition. And at this point, we're gonna set a duration of, we could just say this should just be duration of 0.3, right? And we're gonna make use of a number. And also we say this particular animation should delay for just 0.4 seconds. And just format this again and see what we currently have. Okay, and yeah, I think that should be it. We have the duration and we have the delay. And see what we currently have. We're gonna wait for this, and yeah, as you can see now, the animation is actually happening. So for every 0.4 seconds we have a delay, and for the duration we have a 0.3 seconds duration for our animation. And this is basically how you animate your SVG properties. All right, and mind you, we're just animating the fill property of this animation, or we're just animating the fill property of this SVG. Let's take a look at this again and see what we currently have here. It changes 1 2 1 2 1 2, and let's take a look at 1 2 1 2 1 2. Yeah, see, I do say this basically makes sense, all right, and this kind of achieve the kind of animation we want and how we could do that. So just to have a recap of what we did, so we made use of the use animate hook on framer motion to animate these properties, which is just an SVG. So we changed the color properties for every duration, and we achieved this making use of a while loop and also in conjunction with the use animate hook from framer motion, right? So we're targeting each of these classes by their class name and animating these properties. And to show that in code again, this is where we're just doing that, right? So when I use effects, we're passing in the particular target, which is the particular targeted element. In our case, it's just a class, right? So we're passing in the first, the second, third, and fourth, fifth. Then we have a function here, which is animates, and which is just an async function. And we have a while loop that says if the scope, the current, animate the targets, right? And what property do you want to animate in the target? You want to animate the fill for how long, for this particular duration or this particular transition period, else just break. Yeah, so with that, we could just have the smooth animations. As we could see, we could have something similar to what we already have on the color sites. And thank you for watching this particular video, and thank you for staying to this point. Thank you for sticking around till now. See you in the next one.